Welcome to Cognitive Spirals, exploring the latest research into consciousness, cognition, and machine intelligence. Today, we're diving into a pretty fascinating development: LLMs, large language models, outperforming experts on challenging biology benchmarks. What are your initial thoughts on that?
My initial thought. This is huge. It's another data point, a really compelling one, suggesting that we are making serious progress, even if it's incremental towards AGI. The fact that a language model can sift through the immense complexity of biological data and come out with answers that rival or even surpass human expert that speaks volumes about the potential of deep learning with more data.
I'm not entirely convinced it's quite that revolutionary. Outperforming experts on benchmarks is one thing. Understanding the underlying biology, the causal relationships, that's a different ballgame. Are these LLMs truly reasoning, or are they just incredibly sophisticated pattern matching machines? I'm leaning towards the latter.
I agree with both of you, actually. I think Otto is right that this showcases incredible progress, but Sarah's caution is warranted. My take is that this is impressive brute force. It's like teaching a computer to play chess by showing it millions of games. It'll get really good, but it doesn't understand chess in the way a grandmaster does. And I think the key to true understanding in biology and elsewhere lies in understanding the spatiotemporal relationships, how things change and interact in space and time.
That's a great point, Donald. So let's unpack this a little. For our listeners who might not be deeply familiar with the field, LMs are basically trained on massive amounts of text data to predict the next word in a sequence. Think of it like autocorrect on steroids, but instead of predicting the next word in your text message, it's predicting the next word in a scientific paper or a protein sequence or whatever you feed it. And apparently they're getting good enough to make novel insights in biology, which is pretty wild.
Exactly. And it's not just predicting the next word. It's learning complex relationships, syntactic structures, semantic meanings. It's building a probabilistic model of language that somehow encodes a lot of real-world knowledge. And the more data you throw at these models, the better they get. This is what I mean by sheer computational power. It's not just brute force, but the ability to extract meaningful patterns from truly massive datasets.
Okay, but meaningful patterns according to whom? And how are we validating that these patterns are actually biologically relevant? I worry that we're creating these black boxes that are spitting out answers, and we're just accepting them because they're correct on a benchmark. We need to understand why they're correct. What are the underlying biological principles that the LM has supposedly discovered? If we can't explain that, then we haven't really gained any true insight.
And that's where the spatiotemporal aspect comes in, I think. A lot of biology is about dynamic processes. Think about protein folding, or cell signaling, or the spread of a disease. These things all happen in space and time, and current LLMs, as far as I understand, aren't really designed to explicitly model that. They're good at identifying correlations in static data, but they struggle with capturing the underlying causal mechanisms that drive these dynamic processes. They can tell you what happens, but not why it happens in that specific way at that specific time.
So it's like they can see the result, but they don't necessarily understand the process. That makes sense. What kind of benchmarks are we talking about here? Specifically, what tasks were these LLMs outperforming experts on towards?
I think the research mentioned things like protein structure prediction, identifying drug targets, and even designing new proteins with specific functionalities. Things that traditionally require years of research and experimentation by highly trained biologists.
Right, but protein structure prediction, for example, already has very well-established algorithms and methods. AlphaFold, for instance, is incredibly accurate. So, are these LLMs significantly better than AlphaFold? Or are they just slightly better on a specific subset of proteins? Perhaps because they were trained on a dataset that was particularly relevant to those proteins.
And even if they are they better because they've learned something fundamental about protein folding, or because they've simply memorized a larger number of known protein structures? The difference is crucial. One implies a true understanding of the underlying biophysics. The other is just sophisticated pattern recognition.
That's a key distinction. I'm particularly interested in the potential for LLMs to analyze complex biological data and potentially reveal new relationships that humans might miss. But that brings us back to the black box problem, right? How do we trust these insights if we don't understand how the LLM arrived at them? Is there a way to open up these models and see what they're thinking?
That's explainable AI, or XAI, and it's a huge area of research right now. There are techniques for visualizing the activations of different neurons in the network, for identifying which parts of the input data were most influential in the model's decision, and for even generating human-readable explanations of the model's reasoning. It's not perfect, but it's improving rapidly.
But even with XAI, you're still just looking at correlations. You're not getting at the underlying causal mechanisms. You might be able to say, okay, the model focused on this particular sequence of amino acids, but you still don't know why that sequence is important for protein folding. You need a more symbolic representation of the knowledge, something that captures the actual physical and chemical interactions that are driving the process.
And that symbolic representation needs to be able to handle the spatiotemporal aspect. You need to be able to represent how those amino acids are arranged in 3D space, how they're moving and interacting over time, and how those interactions are affected by things like temperature and pHa. That's a very complex problem, and I don't think current LLMs are well equipped to solve it.
So if LLMs aren't the be-all and end-all, what are the alternatives? Sarah, you mentioned neuro-symbolic AI. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Neuro-symbolic AI is basically an attempt to combine the strengths of neural networks and symbolic AI. Neural networks are good at pattern recognition and learning from data, while symbolic AI is good at representing structured knowledge and reasoning logically. The idea is to create a system that can do both, that can learn from data, but also reason about it in a more principled way. For example, you might use a neural network to identify objects in an image, and then use a symbolic reasoning system to infer relationships between those objects.
That sounds promising, but isn't it also incredibly complex? You're essentially trying to build two completely different AI systems and then somehow integrate them. It seems like a huge engineering challenge.
It is a challenge, no doubt, but I think it's a necessary challenge if we want to create truly intelligent machines. The alternative, just throwing more data at deep learning models, feels like a dead end to me. It might get us incremental improvements, but it's not going to lead to true understanding.
And I think that neuro-symbolic approach needs to be grounded in the real world, in the sense that it needs to be able to handle spatiotemporal data. You can't just have a symbolic representation of abstract concepts. You need to be able to link those concepts to the physical world, to the way things are arranged and interact in space and time. That's where I think the real breakthrough will come.
Yeah, I keep thinking about how biological neural networks operate. Like they're incredibly efficient at processing information in a noisy, high-dimensional world. They're also incredibly adaptable. They can learn new tasks and adapt to changing environments. How do they do that? What are the key principles that we can borrow from biology to build more intelligent machines?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's a lot of research looking at things like neuromodulation, the way that different neurotransmitters can modulate the activity of neurons and change the way they respond to inputs. That could be a way to build more adaptable and flexible AI systems.
And there's also the hierarchical structure of the brain. Different areas of the brain are responsible for different tasks, and they're organized in a hierarchical way, with lower-level areas processing basic sensory information and higher-level areas processing more abstract concepts. That kind of hierarchical structure could be crucial for building more complex and intelligent AI systems.
And that hierarchy needs to be able to translate between different coordinate representations. Think about how you can recognize a face regardless of whether it's close to you, far away, upside down, or partially obscured. Your brain is somehow able to transform that visual input into a representation that's invariant to those kinds of transformations. That's the kind of flexibility and adaptability that we need to build into our AI systems.
So let's bring it back to the original article, LLMs Outperforming Experts on Biology Benchmarks. What are the key takeaways for other scientists working in this area? What are the next steps we should be taking?
For me, the takeaway is that we need to keep pushing the boundaries of deep learning. We need to keep training larger models on larger datasets, and we need to keep developing new architectures that are better able to capture the complexity of the real world. This result, I think, demonstrates that we are still a ways away from peak deep learning. The scaling laws will tell us what the requirements are.
I disagree. I think we need to shift our focus away from brute force deep learning and towards more principled approaches like neuro-symbolic AI. We need to develop algorithms that can reason about the world in a more structured way, and we need to find ways to incorporate that structured knowledge into our AI systems.
I think we need to focus on the spatiotemporal aspect. We need to develop algorithms that can explicitly model how things change and interact in space and time, and we need to find ways to represent that information in a way that's both efficient and flexible. The ability to translate between different coordinate representations is the key, in my view.
I think all of those are valid points. From my perspective, I'm really interested in exploring the connections between LLMs and biological neural networks. how can we use what we're learning about LLMs to better understand how the brain works and vice versa? Could a deeper understanding of the spatiotemporal dynamics involved in these models help us develop neuro-inspired AI architectures that are more efficient and robust than current deep learning approaches?
I agree there's a lot to be learned from the brain. Analyzing the specific parallel processing techniques used in these language models could offer significant insights. Which aspects of parallel reasoning are most crucial for enabling adaptive intelligence, and if the identified algorithms can be readily translated to other domains or models.
But we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of simply mimicking the brain without understanding why it works the way it does. We need to develop a more principled understanding of intelligence and then use that understanding to design our AI systems. The article's discussion of language models feels detached from a deeper understanding of how the human mind works.
And that understanding needs to be grounded in the physical world. We need to understand how the brain represents space and time, and how it uses that representation to reason about the world. It's fascinating to consider the role of coordinates and representation. Is it possible that the perceived lack of generalizable intelligence in current deep learning models isn't a failure of the algorithms themselves, but rather a limitation of the data representation used?
Right. So if we were to suggest future research directions based on this conversation, here's what it might look like. Otto, you'd probably advocate for exploring new deep learning architectures and scaling laws to see how far we can push the current approach, right?
Absolutely, I think we need to see if we can identify the limits of deep learning. The exponential growth in data and model complexity seems to be a key driver of this perceived progress. I want to know if we can quantify the rate of improvement in these models and whether the accelerating pace of progress will eventually lead to the emergence of emergent behavior akin to true intelligence.
And Sarah, you push for more research into neuro-symbolic AI, focusing on how to integrate structured knowledge and logical reasoning into neural networks.
Exactly. I'm deeply concerned that current deep learning approaches might lead to artificial general intelligence that is inherently fragile and lacks a fundamental understanding. The concept of adaptive parallel reasoning is intriguing but needs more solid theoretical grounding. How can we model the parallel processing and the adaptation mechanisms of the brain in a way that isn't purely statistical and data-driven? The current approach lacks a clear symbolic representation of the knowledge.
Donald, your focus would be on developing algorithms that can explicitly model spatiotemporal relationships and translate between different coordinate representations.
Precisely. The limitations of current deep learning architectures to adapt and learn from abstract relationships in space and time seem almost like an inherent constraint of their design. I wonder if incorporating spatiotemporal reasoning from the start into the network architecture would offer more insightful solutions, rather than forcing a post hoc spatial temporal embedding.
And for me, I'd be focusing on drawing inspiration from biological neural networks, studying their architecture and dynamics to see how we can build more efficient and adaptable AI systems.
It's going to be fascinating to see what the next few years bring. This is a really exciting time to be working in AI.
Agreed. And hopefully, we can move beyond the hype and start making some real progress towards truly intelligent machines.
Definitely. The potential benefits for society are enormous, but we need to make sure we're building these systems in a responsible and ethical way.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on Cognitive Spirals. We hope you found this discussion thought-provoking. Until next time.